Hello, friends, and welcome to Evergreen Perspective. I am Ben Chrisley, and I truly appreciate you being here, joining me today. I always understand that you have a lot of things you could be doing, and the fact that you're coming to spend some time with me, that truly means a lot. So I invite you to sit back and relax, and whatever you might be doing, whether you're out for a run or just relaxing with a nice cup of coffee, know that you're always welcome here, and I truly appreciate that a lot. Before we dive in to today's topic, I want to take a moment to do something a little bit different. I've gotten some feedback from the other episodes with the fact that I really haven't introduced myself on this podcast. You know what? That's a fair point. So we're going to change that slowly, little little bit, episode at a time. Episode by episode, I'll try to share pieces of my story with you so that you can get to know me better. And if you so choose, feel free to tell some of your story below in the comments. I always enjoy hearing about other people's stories as well. So I suppose the best place to start is probably from the beginning. I was born in Denver, Colorado, into what would be considered a lower income family. But there's one thing we weren't short on, and that was lots of love in my family. And while my parents did divorce when I was 3, I knew that, they both loved me very much. So that was always lots of love. But it wasn't long after that, my mom did remarry a gentleman from Kentucky. And this marriage would set a stage for a childhood filled with constant movement. I mean, literally. By the time I finished elementary school, I had attended at least 8 different elementary schools, bouncing from Colorado to Texas to Kentucky and back and again. But every movement, learning a new environment, making new friends, and figuring out where I fit in. And just in case that I wasn't adaptable enough, we upped and moved my senior year of high school after I'd been at this one school for 5.5 years. So to say that moving shaped me would be an understatement. It was like living multiple lives at once. Sometimes I was the new kid who quickly made friends, and other times I was the outsider who, had to find my place. Went from being popular at one school to being bullied in another. So the whole experience ran the gambit. But ultimately, I believe it made me stronger. It gave me a unique ability to connect with people from all walks of life and perspectives, from across the country. Those were all different areas we lived in. If you look at those 3 states alone, huge differences there. And that was all before I was even an adult. So plenty of stories I could tell from those times. Obviously some of them hilarious, some of them tough, just like you have. But we're getting into some of those in future episodes where it fits in to the story. We will add those in. All right, as we dive into today's topic, it's sparked considerable debate, like many of the topics we talk about here on Evergreen Perspective. We're going to be talking about the American prison system. We're going to explore the complexities of mass incarceration. We're going to talk about the disparities between nonviolent and violent offenses, the ongoing efforts towards meaningful reform. It's a conversation that touches on justice, equity, and the future of our society. As we know, the United States continues to grapple with one of the highest incarceration rates globally, a situation that has prompted widespread debate and calls for change within our judicial and prison system. Recent events have continued to underscore this urgency. For example, the wildcat strike by correction officers in New York State, right? That over 30 prisons brought quite a bit of attention to the challenges faced in our correctional facilities. The strikes were just this past February, and it was driven by concerns over safety and working conditions. And it led to significant disruptions, highlighting the issues that demand immediate attention in our justice system. In parallel, the Justice Department has announced extensive reforms aimed at reducing suicides and improving mental health care in federal prisons and jails. And These measures were introduced in December of 2024, focusing on updating suicide prevention protocols and implementing data-driven strategies that would help reduce in-custody deaths, right? Because that's what's getting out of hand, not just suicides, but other often deaths that, had to be investigated for cause and, some kind of shady dealings from time to time there. It just further expands the need that we have for comprehensive mental health support for our inmates in the correctional system. But as we navigate this complex landscape, it's crucial to distinguish between nonviolent and violent offenses. While accountability is essential, the approach to sentencing and rehabilitation must be, nuanced. For nonviolent offenses, especially those related to, drug possession or minor infractions, alternative sentencing and rehab programs, need to be offered more frequently. Find effective pathways forward so we can reintegrate folks that make some mistakes along the way, but they were nonviolent, and we should give them a chance to rehabilitate without overly harsh sentences. Conversely, violent crimes such as rape and child molestation and assault, any movement with a deadly weapon, those are significant threats to public safety. In these cases, implementing longer and harsher mandatory minimum sentences can serve to be more of a deterrent and ensure that justice is served in that capacity. I will say, though, it's imperative that these measures are applied judiciously to avoid unintended consequences. Research indicates that mandatory minimum sentences actually don't do a whole lot to deter crime, particularly for nonviolent offenses, haven't been shown to be effective. A study by the Brennan Center for Justice found that policies often lead to substantial harm without corresponding benefits to community safety. So we got a lot to unpack today. In today's episode, we'll explore all those topics. We're going to examine the start of our prison system, which is always a fun ride. And we're going to look at the current state of our prison system, the impact of recent reform acts. We're going to look at some paths forward for a more equitable, effective justice system. And so with that said, let's get started in going back a ways, the origins of the prison system. We're talking pre-colonial and colonial punishments, right? So let's go back in time in America before we had an official prison system. Before the establishment of formal prisons in the late 18th century, colonial America relied on a variety of punitive measures inherited from our European brethren. Right? The primary objectives of these punishments were deterrence, obviously, but retribution and the reinforcement of societal norms came often through public humiliation and physical pain. So what are some of these public humiliations, you might ask? How about the stocks and pillories, right? Offenders were secured in. You've probably seen them, got their head in their hands and their feet restrained to mobilize them. And passerbyers from the town could mock them, insult them, and in some instances even physically assault them. These restrained individuals there in the center of town. One case that I found while putting this podcast together was Titus Oates. He's infamous for fabricating the Popish Plot, a fictitious Catholic conspiracy to assassinate King Charles II. He was sentenced in 1685 to annual pillorying as part of his punishment. When during this sentence, he was often subjected to public scorn, physical assault. This highlights the pillory's role in both punishment and deterrence. Another fun form of punishment they like to use was branding, right? A hot iron, just like it sounds, mark on the skin for criminals so that it would be visible for other people to see and a reminder to them that, they had committed this crime. So one of the cases I found was James Naylor. This is in 1656. James Naylor was a prominent Quaker. He faced severe punishment for his perceived blasphemy after reenacting Christ's reentry into Jerusalem. So, for this, Naylor was branded on his forehead with the letter B to denote blasphemer, ensuring that his transgressions were known by everybody that would see him. Some other acts that one could find themselves branded for. How about some seditious libel? In Maryland, those found guilty of seditious libel um, were branded with the letter S on their cheek, right? Luckily, today's freedom of speech is a protected right. And so expressing dissenting opinions about the government, is no longer considered a crime. Although, if you saw that woman dragged out of that town hall recently in Idaho, you might start to think otherwise. Maybe we were heading back towards some colonial times. But anyway, adultery would get you into some trouble. In colonial New England, individuals convicted of adultery were sometimes branded with the letter A on their chest or forehead. Could you imagine in today's society if people committed adultery and had to be branded? We'd have a population of about 25% would have a brand of an A on their forehead. And coincidentally enough, a recent survey indicates infidelity rates tend to increase with age, with the highest rates peaking for men and women over the age of 60. So we'd have 25% of our older population walking around with big A's branded on their forehead. Other punishments before the prison system was developed could include whipping, which is just like it sounds, right? It's a corporal punishment where offenders were lashed, often in public setting, to obviously instill fear and deter others from committing similar offenses. And, whippings could come at you for any reason. One example is Obadiah Holmes in 1651. Exemplifies the severe religious persecution that dissenters faced during the colonial times. Holmes, he was a Baptist minister. He was arrested in Massachusetts for conducting an unauthorized religious service. And for that instance, he was subsequently subjected to a brutal public whipping of 30 lashes. So can you imagine, right? 30 lashes just for believing something a little bit different. This punishment was so severe that he could only rest on his knees and his elbows for weeks afterwards. Such incidences of religion intolerance has profoundly influenced the founding fathers. Their commitment to ensuring that freedom of religion without fear of prosecution was there. The oppressive actions against individuals like Holmes, underscored the dangers of state-imposed religion and suppression of religious diversity. These historical events highlighted the necessity for protecting individual conscience and free exercise of faith. And obviously this commitment was enshrined in the U.S. Constitution in the First Amendment, which prohibits Congress from making any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So anybody or anyone trying to claim there's a national religion in the United States is therefore going against the Constitution of the United States. By enshrining this in the Constitution, it guaranteed the fundamental right. The founding fathers aim to prevent the reoccurrence of religious persecution and to promote a society where diverse beliefs coexist without fear of retribution. Right? The legacy of Obadiah Holmes and others who suffered for their faith serves as a poignant reminder of the importance of religious liberty as a cornerstone of American democracy. So, very important. Freedom of religion, enshrined in the Constitution. I can't stress the importance of that enough. What's some other things that might get you into trouble back in the day? So in 1645, I found a couple of unmarried couples that were sentenced to whipping for engaging in premarital sexual relations. Could you imagine? Oh boy. Mutilation was also something used. Certain crimes warranted severe physical penalties, such as cropping off the ear or other form of bodily disfigurement, serving as a lasting reminder to the individual and all that saw them about their transgression. They have capital punishment, of course. Hanging was, likely looks like one of the most popular ways. This was obviously reserved for the most egregious offenses. They had public hangings, of course. They served as both a punishment and to deter crimes such as murder or infanticide. Certain sexual offenses could also get you put into the gallows. So that was happening on in colonial and pre-colonial. Um, so they did have jails in colonial America. Obviously, jails primarily served as holding facilities while individuals waited for trial or waited to get their punishment. But so it wasn't really designed for long-term incarceration, and conditions were often deplorable, marked with overcrowding, very unsanitary. I mean, just talking grotesque, disgusting places to keep people. Prisoners were frequently had to bribe their keepers, whoever was doing the jail keeping there, just to get basic necessities. So those that didn't have means, they suffered even more neglect. So I mean, these early punitive measures reflected justice system that was, was about immediate retribution, emphasis on being a public spectacle, to deter criminal behavior and help them meet the community standards. The shift towards institutional confinement and the development of modern prison system marked a significant transformation in the philosophy and practice of punishment in America. In the late 18th century, the American penal system underwent a transformation, a shift from public corporal punishment to more of an institutional confinement. This evolution was influenced by Enlightenment idea, emphasizing rehabilitation over retribution. And so the establishment of the first state prison in the late 18th century marked a significant transformation in the American penal system. It was transitioning from that colonial area, corporal punishment, to that institutional confinement that we're more familiar with today. Notable example was in Massachusetts. They had the Massachusetts State Prison. It was initiated in 1785 in response to these inhumane conditions and influenced by Enlightenment thinkers that were advocating for reform. So people out there were advocating as change agents, which is always important that we have those throughout history. Massachusetts took a pioneering step. The Massachusetts General Court designated Castle Island in Boston Harbor as a state prison. This facility marked a departure from the previous punitive measures that they had, right? Focusing instead on confinement and labor as a means for rehabilitation. The prison was funded by the state and involved repurposing existing military fortifications on that island, Boston Island, to securely house these inmates. This initiative reflected a growing belief in the potential for people to be able to be reformed, right? And the societal benefits from having a more enlightened penal system that gave people a chance to reform where they were at. I mean, the overarching goal of creating the Massachusetts State Prison was to reform criminal justice system by moving away from those, the floggings and the brandings and the pillory, basically moving away from those, medieval type of practices into a focus on confinement and labor so that, we could hopefully rehabilitate the offenders and deter crime through structured discipline. This approach reflected a growing belief in the potential for personal reform, and the societal benefits of a more enlightened group of people. So once again, those change agents wanted to be more enlightened, and they thought this was a good way to go. So this transition in Massachusetts was illustrative of a broader shift across the newly formed United States at the time, where states beginning to, approach crime and punishment in a different way, especially in the post-revolutionary era. The influence of English workhouses that came over from there. So this evolution of the American penal system, it was significantly influenced by these English practices, particularly the establishment of workhouses and the subsequent adoption of imprisonment as the primary form of punishment. So if we go back a little bit to the 16th century England, where some of these ideas came from, societal concerns about poverty and vagrancy led to the creation of workhouses. The first institutional house of correction, known as the Bridewell, was established in London in 1555. At the time, these institutions aimed to address idleness among the poor by providing accommodations and employment, thereby transforming them into productive members of society. So over time, workhouses expanded their role to include rehabilitation of various offenders, not just the indignant. So think about that. I mean, that's wild, right? Because it basically took the poor and the homeless and threw them into these institutions and made them slaves. I mean, crazy times. So some aspects did sound better than public floggings, hangings, and the debauchery that was going on. So the workhouse model and the form came over, but not with a home in the poor. It brought over to get our uh, our inmates with an emphasis on labor and discipline, offering an alternative alignment more aligned with the emerging enlightenment period here, right? So the shift uh, marked the beginning of using incarceration as a central punitive measure. So once the American colonies inherited and adopted the system, the workhouse system for their criminals and not their poor and their homeless, right? So it's for the criminals, not the poor and the homeless like the early workhouse. So thank goodness there we don't think that throwing homeless and the poor into incarceration is the way to go. I don't think that's the answer to homelessness. But they had strict labor and strict discipline as tools for moral reform in these workhouse style prisons. This transition was further solidified in the post revolution as states began constructing penitentiaries designed to isolate and reform offenders. The legacy of the English workhouse is evident in the foundation structure and philosophies of the early American prison system. So, understanding these roots of the American prison system in alignment with that early English workhouse provides, that insight into the historical emphasis on labor and discipline in the correctional practices that we still, implement today to some degree. But it's a continuation of challenges between balancing punishment with rehabilitation, right? This has been an ongoing piece. So if we move ahead a little bit, following the establishment of the early state prisons like Massachusetts State Prison back in the 1780s, the United States witnessed a significant transformation in its approach to incarceration throughout the 19th century. So it continued to evolve. This period marked, a development and a distinct shift in models. So we started coming up with different model systems to use. One of them was the Pennsylvania system. It's a model emphasized solitary confinement with prisoners isolated in individual cells so they could reflect and have some penance. So not a lot of true rehabilitation going on there. As you can imagine, being in isolation 24 hours a day probably isn't the best way to rehabilitate people. You also had the Eastern State Penitentiary, and they call it the Auburn system. It was developed. This system focused on labor by day and solitary confinement by night. So prisoners worked in silence during the day, and then aiming to instill that discipline. They kept them isolated at night with no social structure there. These models influenced prison construction and management across various states, reflecting the continued evolvement of philosophies on crime and punishment. The aftermath, as we go ahead here a little bit, the aftermath of the Civil War and the onset of progressive era brought further changes to the American penal system. So continually evolving, continually moving. These reforms brought in the introduction of parole and probation. So obviously these mechanisms allow for conditional release and supervision, aiming to reintegrate these offenders back into society with some oversight. And so obviously that still plays a role today as that evolution came on. Courts began to impose sentences with variable durations, which was more contingent upon the inmate's behavior and the rehabilitation progress that they were making. How were they getting better? Were they, actually getting rehabilitated? So these reforms signified a shift towards viewing incarceration as a means for rehabilitation rather than, the mere punishment. So we were moving in a little bit better direction here as a whole, right? We went from floggings and whatnot to more of a structured peace here. But by the 20th century, U.S. prison system had expanded significantly. And it started to face big challenges like overcrowding, racial disparities, and debates over the effectiveness of rehabilitation, right? So in the early 20th century, northern states experienced a significant expansion of their prison populations, a trend that was closely linked to the evolving perceptions of race and ethnicity between about 1880 and 1950. The racial disparities in the northern prisons more than doubled, right? With a ratio of non-white to white going from 2 to 1 to 5 to 1. Holy smokes, that's a lot. That's a big change there, right? The primary factor contributing to this disparity was they call it the Great Migration, during which approximately 6 million Black Americans relocated from the South to northern, Midwestern, and Western states, right? This migration took place between about 1910 and 1970. This mass movement was driven by the desire for those individuals to escape the racial violence of the South that they were in, to seek better economic opportunities for themselves. However, the influx of the Black residents into these predominantly white northern communities heightened racial tensions and intensified public anxiety about crime. Right? Prejudices, beliefs, and stereotypes that unjustly associated Black individuals with criminality became more pervasive, significantly influencing public opinion and policy. In response to these unfounded public fears, law enforcement agencies in these northern states started increasingly targeting, the Black and brown communities. This led to disproportionate arrests and convictions of Black individuals, often for minor offenses, and they started getting sentenced to long-term incarceration for minor offenses, further exacerbating the racial disparities in incarceration rates across the board, especially during this period. These developments underscored the profound impact of systemic racism on the criminal justice system during this era. Highlights how deeply ingrained prejudices and discriminatory practices are that contribute to the unjust overrepresentation of Black individuals in prisons.
Kate here with the Civic Corner, taking a few minutes to highlight some opportunities to get involved here in Southwest Washington. If you're not in this area, though, take a look online. I'm confident you'll find some options around you. We'll put a link in the show notes for each of these opportunities and events where you can find more information, including what to expect and how to sign up. Coming up on March 27th, we have 2 events. At 5 p.m., the Washington State Democrats are holding a virtual meeting on issue advocacy. And at 6:30 p.m. is the Ridgefield City Council meeting at the Administrative and Civic Center. On March 29th at 4:30 p.m., the Clark County Republicans are holding an annual fundraiser, the Lincoln Day Dinner. On April 1st, the Waukegan Board of County Commissioners meeting begins at 9:30 a.m. at the County Courthouse in Kathlemet. And there's an ongoing need for volunteers in Pacific County with an organization called Pacific County Immigrant Support. The link in the show notes provides a bit of information about the program and how to sign up. If there's an event in Southwest Washington that you'd like us to feature here on Evergreen Perspective, please put it in the comments or send us an email. This is Kate with Kate's Civic Corner, encouraging you to get out there and get involved. Now back to Ben.
So, this ushers in into the 1970s. The U.S. government, intensified its focus on drug-related offenses. So in 1971, President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number 1, right? Initiating what later becomes known as the War on Drugs. This campaign led to stricter drug laws, increased funding for law enforcement agencies. It was during this time, 1973, that the DEA was formed, right? The Drug Enforcement Administration, to further solidify federal efforts to combat drug use and trafficking. So the 80s saw a continuation and escalation of these policies under President Ronald Reagan administration. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was introduced, it introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, non-violent drug offenses, mandatory minimums, leading to a substantial increase of incarcerated individuals for non-violent drug-related crimes. This legislation, disproportionately affected communities of color, which further contributed to the systemic racial disparities within the criminal justice system. Right? I mean, these combined effect of these policies resulted in a significant surge in the U.S. prison population. Matter of fact, between 1980 and 2005, the number of incarcerated for drug offenses increased over 1,000%. It went from approximately 41,000 to over almost 500,000. By the mid-90s, drug offenders constituted a substantial portion of the federal prison population, with a notable percentage of them serving time for non-violent offenses. Right? This era also saw that proliferation we talked about of mandatory minimum sentences, which often resulted in disproportionately long sentences for these non-violent minor drug offenses. These policies have obviously been widely criticized for contributing to the mass incarceration and for having lasting negative impacts on marginalized communities. Right? So, with all that being ushered in, what do we have? We needed more prison space, right? So, in the 80s, the United States witnessed a significant shift in its correctional landscape, marked by the emergence of private prisons. This development was primarily driven by the war on drugs, right, which is that federal campaign, led that surge of arrests for nonviolent drug offenders. Right? Consequently, what happened? Prison population swelled, resulting in severe overcrowding within public correctional facilities. So to address the crisis, just like government does, anytime we turn to privatization of stuff we need for the government, it doesn't exactly go that great. Government turned to these entities, right, contracting them to take on these prisoners. This move was seen as a cost-effective solution to the growing incarceration rates. Lobbying for harsher sentencing, private prison companies recognize the financial benefits of increased incarceration, right? So they actively engaged in lobbying efforts to influence criminal justice policies. These corporations advocated for stricter sentencing laws, longer sentence minimums for nonviolent drug offenders, trying to get legislation that ensured longer and more frequent incarcerations. These entities sought to maintain and expand their revenue streams. A couple that are really notable are Core Civic and the Geo Group. They're two of the largest private prison operators. They've been documented in major lobbying activities. Between 2012 and 2017 alone, the industry spent over $26 million on lobbying across various states to various, politicians. One avenue where they exert their influence is through the American Legislative Exchange Council, the ALEC. It's a conservative organization that drafts and shares models for legislation. Private prison companies have often been contributors to these guys and have played a role in shaping the bills that come out of legislation. For example, truth in sentencing or the 3 strikes, you might have heard about the 3 strike laws. These came out of that lobbying effort. These policies often result in longer prison terms, right? So thereby increasing the demand for prison space, a demand that these private prisons are happy to fill, right? So they can make more money. The financialization of the prison industry became evident as private prison companies began trading on the stock market, right? The Geo Group, for instance, went public in 94. It's offering investors a stake in the growing incarceration business. Similarly, Core Civic has been publicly traded with its stock performance often reflecting political and policy shifts related to criminal justice. So, if those get harder and they're going to project getting more inmates, their stock goes up. Right? These profitabilities of these companies are closely tied to what is the incarceration rate. Higher number of inmates lead to increased revenue. right? This dynamic creates financial incentive to support policies that result in more incarcerations. You know, to compound this matter or to make them more aggressive, I guess you could say, is Trump's administration's aggressive stance on immigration has resulted an increased number of individuals being detained. To accommodate this surge, ICE, as we know them, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, expanded its contracts with these private prison groups, with these companies, right? Notably Geo Group and Core Civic, which we know are two of the largest beneficiaries of these contracts. The policies favoring increased detention have translated into huge financial gains for these private prison companies. Matter of fact, following President Trump's reelection, this time around here, the shares of Geo Group and Core Civic experienced significant surges. We're talking 74 and 55% respectively. Right? Investors anticipated the administration's continued focus on stringent immigration enforcement would lead to more contracts and consequently higher profits for these companies. So their stock went booming with that piece, right? Private prison companies have actively engaged in lobbying efforts to shape immigration policies in their favor, right? By them advocating for stricter immigration policies and laws, they sought to increase the detention rate. So they wanted a regulatory environment that's conducive to their interest, and their interest is incarcerating as many people as they possibly can. So their influence is evident of the expansion of detention facilities and the implementation of policies that prioritize incarceration over alternative measures. It's crazy. The profit-driven motives of these private prison companies in the context of immigration enforcement, it really questions some ethical issues there, right? It's easy to argue that prioritizing the profits can lead to cost-cutting measures, right? How do companies make more money? They cut costs. So this can compromise the welfare and the rights of these detainees, right? They're human beings. They should be treated well and fairly. Reports have highlighted issues such as inadequate medical care, severe overcrowding, substandard living conditions within these detention centers. I mean, it's not good, right? The intertwining of private profit with public correctional policies has sparked that continued ethical debate. The influence of private companies on legislation undermines the effort towards any legitimate criminal justice reform and continues to perpetrate, mass incarceration. So the ethical implications of profiting from imprisonment, continue to shed negative light on our penal system, right? The impact of incarcerating nonviolent marijuana offenders comes to mind. Despite the legalization of marijuana in many states across this nation, a significant number of individuals remain incarcerated for nonviolent marijuana offenses committed prior to these legal changes. This presents a stark paradox, right? Where while some individuals and businesses legally profit from this growing cannabis industry, others continue to serve sentences for activities that are no longer considered criminal in the same jurisdictions. Right? Advocacy groups estimate that there's over 40,000 individuals in the U.S. that are currently incarcerated for cannabis-related crimes, right? This ongoing incarceration just underscores systemic issues within the criminal justice system, particularly concerning retroactive relief and sentencing disparities that obviously disproportionately affect those marginalized communities that we've talked so much about. Historically, drug enforcement policies have led to a higher rate of arrest and incarcerations among Black and Latino Americans. That's no accident, folks, right? There's heavier policing in those areas, and they get it exacerbates the existing social and economic inequalities. These folks often end up with longer jail times for these minor offenses, right? The United States spends an estimated $80 billion a year on public prisons and jails, with a significant portion of that money is allocated to housing individuals that are convicted of nonviolent drug offenses, including marijuana-related crimes. In some states, it's been clearly proven the cost of incarcerating these individuals, nonviolent drug offenders, outweigh the perceived public safety benefits, right? And this just indicates a misallocation of resources that could be better used to be spent in the community to prevent these folks from getting in these situations to begin with. So beyond the financial implications, the social costs are huge for these communities, right? It continues to lead to economic instability within these vulnerable communities, right? The emotional distress it puts on children as they grow up so that they can, it's going to continue the cycle of where that's coming from, right? Communities with high incarceration rates, have weaker communities, weaker cohesion, and moreover than that, like these individuals, once they get out for, say, these nonviolent marijuana crimes, they experience difficulty with securing employment, getting housing, getting their education completed, right? The incongruity between current marijuana laws and ongoing incarceration calls for comprehensive policy reforms, right? Addressing these issues would alleviate the economic and social burdens that are associated with mass incarcerations and, perhaps would be more equitable justice system that rectifies past injustices related to these nonviolent marijuana offenses. So, we can do better there, right? Determining the exact number of nonviolent marijuana offenders incarcerated in private prisons for me, I found that rather challenging to separate that data to determine how many that is. It's estimated to be about 90,000 was the best number that I could find. And that represents about 8% of the total prison population currently. So these private prisons often have a higher proportion of these nonviolent offenders compared to the public institutions, partly because these facilities are just geared more towards, and they prefer these inmates that need less intense security. So, I think trying to figure out where all these prisons are, especially non-violent marijuana offenders, proved to be a little difficult. So I think we can do better there. But I would like to take a moment to talk about a prime example of how cannabis-related sentence makes no sense in terms of today's laws. I'm going to tell you a story here. 1998, at the age of 29, Edwin Rubis was arrested by federal agents for his involvement in marijuana distribution operation. So he was struggling with drug addiction himself. He became entangled in this operation to repay his debts to the dealers that he owed money to. He chose not to cooperate with authorities at the time. I'm not sure why that was, but he went to trial. It resulted in a 40-year prison sentence, a punishment that stands in stark contrast to today's evolving cannabis laws. Edwin's family has been profoundly affected by his prolonged absence. Obviously, at the time of his arrest, he had a pregnant wife and a 3-year-old son. He had a son from a previous marriage as well. So how that's going to affect those 3 sons, right? Where are they going to end up? Over the past 27 years, Edwin has attempted to maintain relationships with them, but that's very difficult from behind bars. So, his aging parents, they miss him too. They yearn for his return home. During his incarceration, Edwin has demonstrated remarkable resilience despite this long-term sentence for nonviolent marijuana charge. His commitment to personal growth has been huge. He's earned 3 college degrees while he's been in prison. He's got a master's in counseling, and he uses that to counsel other members that are in prison with him. He's been mentoring a lot of fellow inmates and leading Bible studies and just embodying the principles of rehabilitation and transformation like we'd like to see, everybody do, is to rehabilitate. But despite his rehabilitation efforts and the support of advocacy groups, his petitions for clemency have been denied by successive presidential administrations, including that of Bush, Obama, and Biden. And so the reasons for these denials remain unspecified. They don't have to specify a reason that they don't give clemency, but it's left him and his supporters in a state of uncertainty while they still advocate for his release. So, I mean, his story underscores the profound disparities within the criminal justice system, particularly societal perspectives on cannabis as that continues to evolve. So, while the legal landscape shifts towards legalization and commercialization, individuals like Edwin remain incarcerated for actions that are no longer considered criminal in many, many states. Right, his case serves as a poignant reminder of the need for comprehensive reform and reevaluation of sentences imposed under outdated laws. Right, so as he approaches his 56th birthday, he likes to reflect on his journey with a sense of resilience and hope, choosing to celebrate life despite his circumstances. You know, his unwavering faith and commitment to his own personal growth continue to be an inspiration for those that are around him, you know, both inside the prison and outside the prison. So his family, friends, and supporters, they continue to remain steadfast in their efforts to secure his release, advocating for clemency and justice. So they hope that his story will not only bring attention to his plight, but also a catalyst for broader changes to the criminal justice system. You know, so ensure that other people and other families don't have to endure similar fates. So, you know, we need some change there on these nonviolent drug offenders. Do you want more information on Edwin's case or to support efforts towards his release or others? You can go check out the Last Prisoner Project. They got a website. You can get involved there if this is an issue that's passionate to you in the terms of nonviolent cannabis drug charges. Corruption, something we got to check on here. Corruption is another item that plagued the prison system. One of the most egregious that's been happening frequently is extending inmate sentences through fabricated charges. You know, it's probably the most severe form of corruption. It undermines the whole justice system. You know, this often involves prison officials or other inmates. They're falsely accused and incarcerated of infractions leading to prolonged imprisonment. So, such actions stem from various motives. We don't know. Systemic bias, it could be vendettas, financial incentives, especially where private prison systems are involved. Financial incentives could definitely be there, right? Corruption, brings an erosion of trust. When inmates' sentences are unjustly extended, it undermines our public confidence in the criminal justice system. There's nothing justice about that. Right? Fabricating charges to prolong incarceration infringes on these individuals' rights and can lead to severe psychological and emotional distress. That's not rehabilitative at all, right? Such practices, they reflect a deeper systemic problem within the correctional institute. These have a lack of oversight. They have inadequate training. There's a culture that permeates these environments that encourages this misconduct. The American prison system has long been marred by deep seated mistreatment and corruption, manifesting both historically and contemporary contexts, right? These issues have perpetrated cycles of abuse and neglect and injustice within our correctional facilities. It's not hard to find this information on how tainted our prison system is. One of the most egregious examples of historical mistreatment occurred at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. And between 1951 and 1974, Dr. Albert Klingman conducted unethical medical experiments on incarcerated individuals. Can you imagine? He was exposing them to harmful substances without any prior consent. And obviously these experiments prioritize scientific experimentation over the well-being and human rights of the prisoners. They might be prisoners, but they still have human rights. This was a blatant disregard for human dignity. Another chapter in the history of U.S. corrections is convict leasing system. This is prevalent in the post-Civil War South. Under this system, predominantly black prisoners were leased to private enterprises. They were subjected to brutal working conditions, denied basic human rights. They were tortured, beat. Um, Fatalities were common. They perished from abuse and disease and hazardous labor environments. These practices at the time extended the atrocities of slavery under the guise of the criminal justice system. Unbelievable, right? In recent years, they're not immune. In recent years, private prisons have operators have come under intense scrutiny for perpetrating environments that were rife with abuse and neglect. Core Civic, as we know, one of the largest prison companies in the U.S., private prison companies, has faced numerous allegations of mistreatment. Within one facility alone in Tennessee, the company has settled nearly 80 lawsuits for a total of over $4.4 million related to violent beatings, medical neglect, deaths of inmates. Notably, the Trousdale Turner Correctional Center, operated by Civic Corps, is currently under federal investigation due to reports of severe understaffing and unsafe conditions, which just contribute to inmate harm. The federal prison system isn't immune to such issues either. The Federal Correctional Institute in Dublin, California, was recently ordered to close permanently following revelations of sexual abuse by the staff. It was dubbed the Rape Club. The facility became emblematic of the pervasive misconduct and lack of accountability within federal prisons. This closure underscores the urgent need for comprehensive reforms to protect the rights and safety of incarcerated individuals. All right, between the abuse, the poor conditions, and the extension of inmate sentences through these fabricated charges, it's clear it needs immediate attention and reform. So, addressing this issue, it requires a multifaceted approach. We need independent oversights of these prisons outside the system. We need eyes from outside. We need robust legal protections for these inmates. Right? They're humans. They have rights. Commitment to upholding the rights and dignity of all individuals in the penal system is of utmost importance. So what can be done, or what has been done? Let's start with what has been done. The First Step Act was enacted in December 2018. It was a significant bipartisan effort to reform federal criminal justice system. It was aiming to reduce recidivism, modify sentencing laws, and improve prison conditions. A key component of the act is development of a risk and needs assessment. It was designed to evaluate inmates' likelihood of reoffending and guide them towards evidence-based programs that have been shown to help with rehabilitation. And these programs got you time credit as you completed them effectively. The act also expanded the safety valve provision, granting judges greater discretion to impose sentences below these mandatory minimums for certain nonviolent drug offenses. And thereby this was supposed to help promote fairer sentencing practices. The legislation also sought to enhance prison conditions by prohibiting the use of restraints on pregnant inmates. That seems like that should be a given. And maintaining, when feasible, keeping these prisoners within 500 miles of their home so that they could maintain some bond with their family. However, the implementation of the First Step Act has faced several challenges, resource limitations, understaffing, underfunding, right? They don't have the money to hinder delivery of adequate rehabilitation programs. Reports indicate that approximately 25% of those serving over a year in prison haven't even began any of these programs. And this is due because they're all on the wait list to get into the basic literacy classes, right? That's why we need better education in America. A better education system all the way up through K through graduation is going to end a lot of these prison sentences likely because they wouldn't be in prison to start with. So for the Bureau of Prisons to get this program going, they need a lot more funding and staff to make it happen. So, developing clear, uniform guidelines, can assist prison officials and the courts to apply these acts a little bit better and make it more fair. So, but they need the resources to do it. The American prison system stands at a critical juncture, necessitating comprehensive reforms that address the root cause of mass incarcerations, like education, prioritizing rehabilitation over mere punishment. Right? We need to eliminate the profit-driven incentives that perpetuate injustice. It's imperative to uphold the principles that those who commit crimes must face appropriate consequences. It's equally important to recognize the difference between violent and non-violent offenses. Individuals convicted of violent crimes, such as rape, child molestation, repeated domestic abuse, assault, anything with a deadly weapon, they pose a significant risk to public safety. For these serious offenses, implementing longer, harsher sentences can serve as a deterrent and ensure that justice is served. We'll note that the National Research Council reported that between 1980 and 2010, half of the 200% increase in the U.S. population was due to longer, exaggerated sentencing, much of it stemming from these mandatory minimums for nonviolent crimes. These findings suggest that while strict sentencing may be warranted for violent offenses, a more nuanced approach is necessary for these nonviolent crimes, right? To prevent exacerbating the issues that are within the justice system. Further data from the United States Sentencing Commission reveals that individuals convicted of violent offenses have a lot higher rate of being reincarcerated than the nonviolent offenders. So this underscores the need for targeted interventions to address the specific risk and rehabilitation needs of violent offenders to continue to enhance our public safety. So, while it's essential to enforce stringent penalties for violent crimes to protect society and uphold justice, we must also strive for some balance and equitableness within the criminal justice system. This includes continuing to reevaluate mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent offenses, investing in rehabilitation programs so we can ensure that our policies are not disproportionately impacting our marginalized communities. If we can adopt a more discerning approach, we can work towards a system that not only punishes wrongdoing, but also fosters rehabilitation and reduces reincarceration, ultimately leading to safer and more just society. Right? We know that the American prison system is full of contradictions. None more than the glaring fact of people like Edwin Rubis, who remain behind bars for something that is now a legal multi-billion-dollar industry. His story and stories of thousands like him force us to confront, that uncomfortable truth. Our justice system is not always just. It's just not. We've talked a lot today about corruption, sentencing, the profit-driven motives of private prisons, and the deep mistreatment that has plagued our correctional facilities for centuries. We've talked today about corruption, sentencing, the profit-driven motives of private prisons, and the deep mistreatment that has plagued our correctional facilities for centuries. While reforms like the First Step Act are a step in the right direction, they don't go far enough. The system needs to do better. Not just for those unfairly incarcerated, but for society as a whole. Now, let me be clear about something. If you do the crime, you gotta do the time. Violent crimes such as rape, child molestation, child pornography, repeated domestic abuse, assault with a deadly weapon, murder, etc., deserve long, harsh sentences. Society has an obligation to protect the innocent and ensure those who pose real threat are kept off the streets. But when it comes to nonviolent crimes, particularly those that no longer even exist under current laws, we have to ask ourselves, is justice really being served? Edwin Rubis has spent more than 25 years in prison for marijuana. Meanwhile, Politicians, celebrities, and Wall Street investors are making millions off the very thing that stole his freedom. His family is still waiting for him to come home, and he's been passed over for clemency time and time again. So I'll leave you with this question. If we can change the laws, why can't we change the sentences? Great question. This conversation doesn't end here. If you want to learn more about cases like Edwin's, check out organizations like the Last Prisoner Project, which is fighting for those still incarcerated for cannabis-related crimes. And if this episode's resonated with you, share it, talk about it. Make sure you follow, give 5 stars, all those good things. Comment below on your thoughts on it. Because the more people who understand the reality of our prison system, the harder it becomes to ignore. So, let's talk about it. Keep the conversation going. I want to thank you for joining me today on Evergreen Perspective. I always appreciate your time, your open mind, and your willingness to engage in these tough conversations. Until next time, I encourage you to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep questioning the world around you. Once again, I'm Ben Chrisley. Take care of yourself and each other. Until next time, bye-bye.